Hello everybody, and welcome to my video on the Olympus Pen D3. This was a camera that took me quite a while to get my hands on in any kind of working condition, in any kind of affordable price and working condition. These are highly sought after Olympus Pen models. They are widely regarded for the viewfinder series of pen cameras, not the SLR series. Those are a higher spec camera. These are widely regarded as having the highest quality lens of any of the viewfinder cameras. And that owes to the 32mm f1.7 lens on this, which is, yes, quite a staggeringly good performer. I have not compared it to the other Pen Ds that I have, or Pen E cameras. I can tell you that it's significantly better than the EES's lens. All right, at any rate, enough of that. This is a 35mm half-frame, fully manual viewfinder camera. So let's take apart what that means. It means that it takes 35mm film, and with some caveats, any 35mm film will work. We'll cover that throughout the course of the video. Fully manual means that you set the aperture and the shutter speed yourself, and we'll see how to do that through the course of the video, and also how to read the light meter. And it will be based on a light meter reading, and as long as you read the light meter correctly and dial in your settings correctly, then the exposure should theoretically be accurate. And it is a viewfinder camera, meaning that this is a light meter window here, and this is a viewfinder window. There is no range finding mechanism, which means that when you focus, you just either have to measure your distance or eyeball it, or use zone focusing to obtain proper focus. It has a cadmium sulfide cell scene meter. That's right here. This is the CDS cell. CDS cells are good cells, and generally speaking, they remain reliable today as long as you have a proper battery installed. It uses a leaf shutter with shutter speeds of bulb and then 1/8 of a second to 1/500th of a second, so a fairly good range. And honestly, if you need to go longer than 1/8, you can kind of just guess at that with bulb and get pretty close. 1/4 second are pretty easily estimable in bulb mode, at least to within the exposure tolerance of your film. It has a flash sync right here as your PC port. There's no flash shoe on your camera, and that flash sync is at any of the shutter speeds. Now, the reason the flash syncs at any shutter speed is because it has a leaf shutter. If you imagine that my hands are the leaves on the shutters, whenever you take a picture, the leaves have to open completely and then close. And they open very quickly. Every single shutter speed, they're opening functionally instantaneously and then closing again. And then the shutter speed is just determined by how long that takes. So at 1/500th of a second, the leaves have to open all the way up, the flash triggers, and then it closes. So that's why the flash sync is any speed. The target market for the Olympus Pen D would have been the advanced viewfinder user, or also somebody looking for a compact, easily carried, high-quality camera that could allow them to make the most of their film by fitting 48 exposures onto a 24 shot roll, or I guess actually they used 18, 20, and 36 back then, which would have been 36, 40, and 72. It has an exceptional lens, it really does, which is very fast at f1.7, meaning that it has some good low light capabilities. It has gorgeous design. Now, I know that design is a bit subjective, but I do think this is the nicest looking of the Olympus Pen rangefinder cameras. It has fully manual operation based on a light meter that you operate. Fantastic build quality. I mean, all of the pens are really, really well-made cameras, but this is just a notch above them in terms of the way that it's built. And the viewfinder also has a close focus frame. If you were to look through it, there's a secondary frame in there, which helps you frame up your your subjects that are within 1 meter of the front of your lens, which is basically, you can see here the lens's focus on the side goes from infinity down to 0.8 meters. So anything here, there's a detent, a click detent at 1 meter to let you know you're there, and then everything closer than 1 meter would use the secondary focusing frame inside of the viewfinder window. Very clever design with a good reminder that there is that when you get down to that 1 meter distance. These were made by Olympus in Japan from 1965 until I don't know when. I tried to find the year that they went out of production and I was not able to. They were preceded by the Olympus Pen D2 and they were concurrent with the Pen EEL and the Pen EES-EL. And then they were followed by nothing directly, as this was the end of the Pen D half-frame viewfinder lineup. So if you have your Olympus Pen D3, we're going to go over what everything on the camera is, and then we will talk about what it does and how to use it to take photos. Put that back on later. So we're going to start technically here on the sides of the camera with the strap lugs. This is what you would connect your camera strap to, and as you can see, this is really small, so just a little wrist strap is perfect for this. You don't need anything huge or really bulky to distribute the weight, because this thing's, I mean, it's dense and heavy for its size, but it's very light. So anyway, strap lugs. Film rewind knob. Now this post does not lift out because you don't need to do that. So this is fixed in place. If your post lifts out, you have broken your camera, so don't do that. Anyway, film rewind knob, Pen D, serial number, film plane indicator, light meter right here. You can see the needle is that little red needle that gives you a light meter reading. There we go. We'll see how to use that later in the video. Shutter button. That little hole right there is a cable release socket. Frame count dial, and this is a manually reset dial right here. And you can see it also spins around. It's a bit challenging to read sometimes, but that little arrow points to the number frame you're on. Let's set this to 20, and we'll now find out whether this counts up or down. Looks like it counts down. I can never remember with these anymore. At any rate, so I'll show you how to set that when we load film in just a moment. On the front of the camera, Olympus Pen, light meter reading, Pen D3. In case you were wondering what model camera you have, it's written in 3 places on this camera. Viewfinder window, that's the EL sticker if your camera still has it, which indicates that it has a light meter. Flash PC socket, lens right here. On top of the lens, you can see the shutter numbers, and this is the front dial adjusts your shutter speed. Should do that after triggering the shutter. So that's your shutter speed adjustment. Then this rear dial here adjusts your aperture. And there is a number right there in that little silver opening. Number 15 is, nope, what's the highest number? 17 is the highest number. And the lowest number is 11. Is that right? No, it's got to be lower than that. Yeah, it is. Lowest number is going to be 7. So 7 to 17. Those numbers are exposure values. I gotta imagine that actually goes even lower than that. Maybe not. No, it doesn't. Okay, now what do those numbers mean? Those numbers correspond with these up here in the meter. And when we look at how to read the meter, I'll show you how to do the calculations to get your shutter speed. Over here we have the focus knob. And there are a couple of detents for zone focusing. Well, there's 2 detents. One here at the 1 meter that we talked about, and then another one here for zone focusing, which is at the 3 meter mark. You can see that 3 is orange. So basically, if you were to set this detent here at 3, and then your aperture at f16, and then your shutter speed, whatever it needed to be for f16, you would have hyperfocal distance, which is infinity to closer than 3 meters. I don't know exactly what it is with this camera, but I'm going to guess it's around 1.5 meters, ballpark. So at any rate, that would allow you to obtain the maximum depth of focus with your camera for easy snapshot shooting. Then on the camera's back, viewfinder window, light meter activation button, film advance dial right here. Didn't break my camera. Thought I did for a second. It's just that the shutter is so quiet I couldn't hear it. There we go. Okay. Camera's bottom, film back release, tripod socket, film rewind button. Oh, and on the bottom here also, we have the ISO setting. This little dial is what you would set for your ISO. And the ISO goes from, well, ASA and ISO firstly are the same thing. So if you're using 100 ISO film, that would be 100 ASA. So the range that your camera's exposure calculator can do is from 10 ISO to 400 ISO. 10 ISO would be something like an ADOX CMS2 that's pull to stop, and then the 16, 24, and 32 are the other bizarre numbers in here. 50, 100, 200, and 400 are pretty normal. Inside of the camera we access by flipping this lock up, rotating it a half turn, and then pulling the camera's back off of the camera. This is the film cassette chamber. This is where the film cassettes will go when we load them. These silver rails here are your silver film guide rails. The outer two are designed to prevent the film from moving up and down as it travels, and then the inner two sandwich against the film pressure plate here to keep the film flat as it travels through the camera. Here we have the film take-up sprocket, which when we advance the film, spins, and that pulls the film evenly through the camera. This is the film advance sprocket. This is the film take-up spool. This is the shutter box right here. This, you can see where the lens is. That's the actual size of the negative. Here we saw the film pressure plate, which keeps the film flat as it moves in front of the lens. And this spring right here keeps the cassette properly aligned so that it feeds the film correctly and then takes it back up correctly. And then you can see the lock button right here, the lock connection. And then there should also be foam along the front of this film back here. That's one of the things I'll be putting in, restoring later today. The foam was completely shot in this camera, so it's going to get some felt. And then here we have your battery chamber. And while we're here, we're going to talk about battery options for you. So you can see the battery it's a 675 type mercury cell battery is what it calls for. This is a 357 type LR44, A76, S76, whatever battery. The 675 hearing aid batteries will work. These actually have too much voltage. And so even though I have it in here because I don't have any 675 hearing aid batteries right now, this will provide too much voltage, which will cause your camera to underexpose. So we change the battery by removing the battery cap and just swapping out the old for a new battery, right? So if you don't have so if you have the 675 battery, just install it and you're fine. If you don't have it, you have a few different options. I would not personally take this apart and try to install the circuitry modification. These are so densely packed inside, I'm not sure that it would fit. I would send that to a professional to have that done. But if you just have access to the LR44, A76, S76, 357 batteries, just drop it in there, screw this back on, and what we're going to do next is we're going to trick the camera into giving us a proper meter reading with this battery. So when we're outside in full sun with the sun to your back, what you want to do is take a meter reading, okay? And that meter reading, what we know is that 15 will be the correct exposure value for your meter outside in full sun with 100 ISO at f16. So what we're going to do is we know that the camera thinks right now that it's 9. In reality, outside, I'm indoor under studio lights, it's going to read low, but in reality, under outside lighting conditions, it should say something in the 11 to 13 range. What we're going to do next is we're going to come down here to the ISO dial, and we're going to adjust this until we get to the actual proper meter or exposure value number. Maybe it would be higher than 15. I can't remember. I cannot remember which way this one would go, honestly. If you're outside in full sun with the shutter speed at your film speed and the aperture at f16, you'll get a different meter reading than I did. And then what you want to do is you want to adjust the ISO dial until you get this number in the silver ring here to match what is in this dial. And what you're doing with that is you're tricking the camera into giving you a proper meter reading because you're telling it it's got a different film speed. So that allows you to use the camera's ISO range to compensate for your film speed. Now because this has a very limited range of film speeds of 10 to 400, there's a limited number of film options you're going to be able to do with that. So it's a technique you can use. The other thing you can do is leave the battery out, which is always a good idea for fully mechanical cameras if you don't need a meter, because that guarantees the battery won't explode in your camera because it won't be there. And then use either a handheld light meter or a cell phone light meter app. And with cell phone light meter apps, those can work, but different cell phones have different sensors and different builds, and then the apps actually work a little bit differently with them. So if you're going to do that, what you want to make sure you do is that you again calibrate the cell phone meter app with the Sunny 16 rule, or at least just verify that the cell phone meter reading is coming in at a correctish number. If you're within a stop, like let's say 1/125th and f16, if you're anywhere from 1/60th to 1/250th with your cell phone meter reading app, you're gonna be okay with black and white and color negative film. Okay, that's a whole lot of detail about how to use the light meter on this camera, and I hope that was helpful in explaining. Next thing, while we're talking about the light meter, let's actually talk about how to take a meter reading and what it means and how to dial it in. Okay, so to take a meter reading, we're going to hold the button on the back, and that's going to put the needle at one of these numbers here from 3 to 17. So it's at 9 right now, okay? So let's assume that we have already calibrated our film speed and, against the voltage difference of the camera. So what we need to do is we need to adjust these until we get to 9. Which is not a whole lot of light. So that's 9 right there. Okay, so now what we've done is we've brought up this number 9. That's our exposure value number. The exposure value number is used to give us proper exposures across any combination that now exists. So 1/8 of a second and f5.6 will work. So will f2 and 1/60th of a second. And we know that because it still says 9. So once you get the number dialed in, what you do is grab both rings and adjust them at the same time. That will keep your exposure dialed in properly and allow you to pick all of the different shutter speed and aperture combinations that you can access with the given lighting conditions and the film that you have installed in your camera. So with the lighting that I have right now and the film we have installed, anything from 1/60th of a second in f2 to 1/8 of a second in f5.6 will give me a proper exposure. I could also theoretically do f8 and bulb and hand hold it for about 1/4 of a second, or f11 and bulb for a half, or f16 and bulb for a full second. Those are other viable options. Let's get this back to where it was. There we go. Okay. And that's how you use the meter to dial in your settings and get a proper exposure. While we have the camera's back off, let's load film and see how this works. So this is a roll of 200 ISO film. What we're going to do is we're going to drop it into the film cassette chamber, pull the leader out here, and feed it into the film take-up spool. I'm going to trigger the shutter. Should have done all that shutter adjusting with the shutter triggered. All right, fed it into the film take-up spool, and now we're going to advance it here. I'm going to do 3 because that looks like it wants to pop off. But it's not going to, magically for a change. Okay, now we've got that loaded. We're going to close and lock this. We're going to do 2 shots. Now we know that that was a 24 exposure roll. So what we're going to do is we're going to dial this. We're going to push down on this. You don't want to just, well, I guess you can just spin it, but I find pushing it is a little bit easier. We're going to take this up to 48. Now the way that this counter works, it's going to count down as we saw earlier. Each one of those hatch marks in between the major numbers counts as 2. So right now we're at 48, which is 1 hatch shy of 50. So as we go about the day taking our photos, oh, and of course remember, after you load your film, by the way, you want to dial in your ISO and do your exposure Sunny 16 compensation if you need to. And also a good idea is always to take a bit of slack out, because this way, if you take slack out of the film, when you advance the film, you can see the film knob rotating, ensuring that the film's being taken off the camera. There's a mechanical connection here in the film. When the film gets pulled out of the cassette, it necessarily has to spin this. So this is your way of knowing that film's moving through the camera. So basically just go through your day taking photos, adjusting your shutter speed to take photos at different speeds. And when you're done, you're going to rewind the film. Before we do that, I'm going to show you what happens inside the camera. Now, film is one and done. It can record light exactly 1 time. In a controlled manner, which will give you a proper exposure through a proper shutter speed and aperture, or in an uncontrolled manner, where the film will absorb every photon that comes its way by doing this. So if you take the back off of your film after you take shots, you won't see any photos on it. You'll see nothing. You'll never see anything because all of the film will have absorbed all of the light it can. If you pull your film out of your cassette before taking photos, you will ruin it. It will not be able to record any images. But when you have the film back on, what happens inside your camera is you take a picture and then you advance the film, and the camera advances it just enough to get to the next frame and leave a little bit between the 2 frames. There we go. And it just goes on like this. Now at the end of the day, of course, with your film back still on, you would push down the film rewind button right here, which connects to that pin that my finger is on right now, and then you would rewind the film. And when you rewind the film, this is what happens inside the camera. Now, in real life, what you would do is you would want to rewind the film all the way into the chamber. I have to reuse this film, so I'm not going to do that, but leaving a leader like this is a really good way to accidentally reuse film and get some unintended double exposures. So now what you would do is you would unlock your film back and you would take it off, and then you would take out your roll of film, put it in your pocket to save it so you can develop it, and then grab another one and put it in. Or if you are done shooting for the day, you just put your film back onto the camera, lock it, make sure your shutter's been tripped, and put your camera back in your pocket and call it a day. Next thing we're going to talk about is how to use a flash with this camera. There's only one way to use a flash, which is with the PC port. So any flash you get, you will need a PC cable to connect it. It's a specific type of flash cable. If your many flashes have a connection that allows a cable to go directly to the flash. If yours doesn't, there are also hot shoot cable adapters you can get there. They're $5, give or take. So I used one of those for years. Very useful, and it allows you to plug a flash into your PC port if your flash can't do it itself. So then, so you have your flash plugged in here. Let us pretend that this is your flash, this spare studio light, and I know it is relative to the camera, perhaps a little large. So let's pretend this is your flash. You've got a cable connecting the PC port. Let's go over what you would then do is you'd have what's called a flash bar. which is a piece of metal with a 1/4-20 screw on each end of it. Screw into the bottom of your camera and into the bottom of your flash, or into the bottom of your hot shoe to PC cable adapter. And then what you would do is you would have the camera, the flash, like this over to the side. The worst possible place to have a flash is right on top of the camera. So or even right next to it can be kind of rough. Basically, when we see something outside or inside, when we look at any person or object, they are generally lit from above, and that's what our brains associate with being normal. So when you have your flash, one thing you want to do is try your best to replicate natural lighting. So to that end, having a flash with an articulating head is always a good idea. You can bounce the light off of the ceiling, and what happens is if in this setup, the light would leave your flash, reach your subject, bounce back to your film, and your subject would end up looking a little bit flat and waxy. If you bounce your flash up off of the ceiling, the light leaves the flash, bounces off the ceiling, comes down to your subject, comes back to your lens, and then you end up with natural looking lighting where the light has been softened and diffused by bouncing off of the ceiling, but also more importantly is coming from above so it looks natural. All right, then there are a couple of ways to do that. You want to get an articulating head if you can. If you can't, you can always shoot this camera in landscape mode, and then the flash bars have the ability, because they have a 1/4-20 nut, to adjust the angle of the flash itself. You'd be stuck shooting all your portraits in landscape mode that way, but it is an option if push came to shove. Now, as I said, the flash sync speed is any speed with this camera. So whatever shutter speed you set, you can use a flash. And then after that, it's just a matter of trial and error and learning for yourself what settings work best with your specific equipment. Also, now everything we just talked about with flash applies to modern flashes. If you just went and went to whatever camera stores in your town and bought whatever flash they have that was the least expensive, all of that would apply to this. If you went up online and you bought 1980s Vivitar 283 or 2500 or any of those, or Sunpack or Focal or whatever other third-party brand, all of that applies. This camera can also use M bulbs. In all probability, you are not using a flash with a bulb. If you have to replace the bulb after every single flash use, then you're using a bulb flash and you're an advanced enough user that you know how to use a flash already. If you're just picking this up for the first time and you're using whatever flash you can get your hands on, it's probably an X flash, which stands for xenon, where the bulb can be discharged thousands upon thousands of times before it burns out. Everything that we've talked about applies for that type of bulb. So we've gone over literally everything there is to go over with this camera except how to take a picture with the camera. It is possible to do double exposures, but with older cameras like this, I strongly recommend against it, but we'll go over that. Okay, so let's talk about taking a picture. What you're going to do is the first thing you want to do is get all of your settings dialed in, which is going to be, you've got your ISO set and correctly, and you've got your film, it's compensated if needed. You're going to take a meter reading. You're going to read the EV value. Let's say that the EV was 13. Okay, 13. We're going to stop down a little bit here until we get to 13, which means 1/60th of a second and F8 will work. We're going to dial that in, and now we can decide what specific, now we can decide what specific shutter speed and aperture to use, okay? Anything from 1/15th of a second at f16 up to 1/500th of a second at f2.8. Okay, so one trick with this camera is don't immediately advance the film after you're done with your shot. Advance the film prior to your next shot. That way you can adjust the shutter speed without risking damaging your shutter mechanism. Leaf shutters can have a hard time with adjusting the shutter speed after it's been armed. So it's a little bit different than your standard focal plane shutter, which you can adjust the shutter speed of at any point. So next we're going to advance the film and arm the shutter. We're going to dial in our focus. That focus looks good. We're just going to take our picture. You want to, of course, when you take the picture, look through the viewfinder window to frame up your scene and take the photo. All right, so now if you wanted to take double exposures, the process for that is that after you take the picture, what you're going to do is you're going to take your first picture, going to hold down the film rewind button, you're going to hold the film rewind knob, and then you're going to advance the film. That will arm the shutter and prevent the film from moving. Okay, then what you're going to do is take your second shot. That's the mechanics behind it. What about the science behind it? So if you have a piece of film, it has a certain amount of light that it can have on it and still have a proper exposure. So in this case, that would be 1/60th of a second at f8 is our single proper exposure. Okay, if we took two exposures at 1/60th of a second and f8, the film would receive twice as much light as it can handle, and your negative would end up being dark, dense, or thick. Those are three words that mean the same thing, which is that it has too much light. The results of that are you would lose contrast, you would have extended printing times if you're in the darkroom, and you'd have extended digitization times with digital noise if you're digitizing on a scanner or with a DSLR. So to get a proper double exposure, we need to cut the amount of light in half. These are all fractions. Every number on these two rings, these two black rings, is a fraction. So we know that if we're at 1/60th of a second and f8, we have to cut the amount of light in half. Even though 1/125th of a second is a higher number, because it's a fraction, it's half as much time, half as much light. So one way to do the double exposure would be to do two exposures at 1/125th of a second if we're in the same lighting conditions. Or we are married to doing 1/60th of a second for whatever reason. Or maybe it's an even longer exposure. We're trying to do two waterfalls, and it's going to be two 5-second exposures. Who knows? At any rate, we're married to this shutter speed for a specific reason. We can compensate with the exposure aperture dial. With the aperture dial, again, fractions, higher numbers are less light. So we'd use f11, which is one stop faster, half as much light. When you hear the term stop, every stop is half or double the amount of light as the one next to it. 1/8 of a second is twice as much light as f11. f11 is half as much light as f8. Okay, so you could do that either way. Two shots at that shutter speed, compensating with the aperture, or two shots at a faster shutter speed, leaving the aperture in place, depending on your creative intent. Okay, what if we're taking a double exposure a few hours apart? We're going to take a picture of a scene during the day, like a building, and we're going to leave the camera exactly in place, and we're going to finish that shot after dark when those buildings' lights are lit up. And that way what we'll do is we'll get like a picture of the building during the day, but we'll also get the lights coming through the windows, which could be a really good and interesting effect. All right, so let's say that during the day, we're going to need 1/500th of a second at f5.6 to get a proper exposure. We're going to take that picture. Actually, we're not, because we have to compensate for our light levels first. We can't go any faster than 1/500th. So we're going to cut the amount of light in half with f8. Now we're going to take our picture, we're going to hold the film rewind knob, hold the film rewind button, advance the film, and now we're going to be ready to take our second one, but we don't know what settings we need. So we're going to come back 3 hours later, the camera's like on our patio or in a safe place where it's not going to get knocked over by the wind or stolen. And now we take another meter reading. And we know from this meter reading that what we need at f5.6 is a 4-second exposure. Okay, come on. There we go. So we're going to need a 4-second exposure at f5.6. Now what we can do in this case is we can either go to 8 seconds, which would be my recommendation, or we could go to f8. This is not including reciprocity failure, so if you have a question about long exposure reciprocity failure, that's added complexity. Maybe a better example would be to say 1-second exposure, which doesn't need reciprocity failure, at f5.6. So what we would do is we would either make this a 1/2 second, which we don't have a setting for, or we'd go up to f8, Or we would honestly just leave this at a proper exposure to make the lights in the windows even brighter. All up to your creative preferences. At any rate, whatever you dial in, take your picture and then advance your film normally. After that, what you want to do is you want to put your lens cap on, take a dead frame, advance your film, and then you are ready to go for your next shots. Now, the reason that you take a dead frame after your double exposure is because your film is right here. You've just taken your double exposure. When you start advancing the film, it takes a moment for the gearing to re-engage, so it doesn't instantly start advancing. It starts advancing and it will only advance part way. Maybe 50% of the frame, maybe 95% of the frame. Doesn't really matter that much. When you take your next exposure, there's going to be some amount of overlap. If you take the dead frame, that guarantees that the film has moved out of the way of the next exposure and that you don't ruin both your double exposure and the subsequent image. Some things not to do with your Olympus Pen D3. Don't store the camera with the shutter ready to fire. When you're done for the day, always disarm the shutter. Now, the reason for that is because these are mechanical cameras. Everything in the mechanism is clockwork, so it times everything by using springs. When you arm the shutter, you put tension on those springs. If they stay like that for an extended period, they develop a bit of memory, and that can either make your shutter inoperable or throw off the timing. Either situation is not good and requires a professional repair. Don't leave your camera in plastic bags or boxes unless you have a good rechargeable desiccant pack that you keep recharged. And the reason for that is plastic is permeable, so moisture will get through it. And once moisture is in there, it finds the camera leather and will make that mildewy, finds the camera's optics and can get fungus on that. A mildewy camera is a terrible thing to have up to your nose, and optics with fungus can really impair image quality. So you don't want either of those situations. Don't leave your camera in your car. If you leave it there for a long time, heat damage can cause oils to get thin and get into the mechanisms where they shouldn't be. When it gets back to a normal temperature, those oils cause the mechanisms not to function properly. And by a long time, what I mean is like a day or an afternoon. If your car is really hot and you leave it in there for half an hour, that can be too long. So in addition to that, it's also really easy for a car thief just to break your window, reach in and steal your camera, and you to come back to a broken window and no camera. So anytime you're out with a camera, it's a good idea. It doesn't matter how quick your stop is. Take your camera gear with you. It's a good way to ensure that you keep it, and also that you keep it in good working order. Don't let your camera get wet. These are not weather sealed and they are all metal, and they can rust on the inside, which will lock up your mechanisms and ruin your camera. And just remember that your Olympus Pen D3 is a precision tool that should be handled with care and respect. As long as you take care of your camera will take care of you. Thank you for watching this video. Please give me a thumbs up. That lets me know that I'm on the right track producing content which is useful and helpful to you. If you have any questions or comments, please leave those in the comments section below. I'm pretty good about checking these every couple of days and answering questions. If you have any suggestions or ideas for future videos, and if I have the technical know-how and equipment, I'm more than happy to make those. One last thing. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. I gotta get up, Steinbeck. I have to turn off the camera.